The People's Republic of China and Republic of China have been at odds for decades, and in the last few years, rhetoric coming from Big China has been such that the issue of China's national reunification, as Xi Jinping puts it, has to be resolved eventually, even if by force. 2022 brought the world the biggest war in Europe since World War II. It's still ongoing and seems to be heading towards at least a year more of open conflict. The US is deeply involved there. The events in and around Israel are also taking some of the US focus away from China. So a question may be posed. From China's perspective, if it wanted to invade Taiwan, would now be the best time for China to do it? Would the US be too distracted now? This video will try to answer that. The Philippines would play a large role in any US defense plan for Taiwan, so I've started playing a game of Conflict of Nations which is sponsoring this video as the Philippines. Conflict of Nations is a free online PvP grand strategy game. I chose the Philippines, but you can choose almost any other real country and lead it through World War III. There are game modes with up to 128 players duking it out for world domination. I usually check up on my game progress on the PC from work and then switch to my phone when I get home. I'll tell you more about the game later on, but for now know that if you register using the link below in the video description, you'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Offer is available for just 30 days, so lose no time. Xi Jinping's visit to the US in November sent some mixed messages. A message of hope to have peace over Taiwan, but also a message saying that China may not wait forever for Taiwan's issue to be resolved. Xi allegedly said peace is all well and good, but at some point we need to move toward resolution more generally. Xi also allegedly said China does not have any plans to invade, commenting on US estimates that an invasion might happen by 2035. Assuming a decision to invade does get made, would the end of 2023 or early 2024 be the best possible moment for China to do it, and the most dangerous moment for Taiwan and the US if it wants to defend it? Indeed, the US will remain involved in Ukraine, and if the war in Gaza somehow escalates and the US finds itself bombing Hezbollah in Lebanon or even bombing Iran, some say all that might constitute enough distraction that the US will not be able to come to Taiwan's aid. When it comes to Ukraine, the US has committed almost $70 billion to Ukraine as of July 31st, 2023. Actual figure added 2 more billion for the military, but not all financial aid was actually handed over to Ukraine, so the total tally still hovers around 70 billion. That may sound like a lot for a year and a half of aid, but is it really? In 2022, the US federal budget spent $6.3 trillion. In a year and a half, the US thus spent some $9.5 trillion. During that time, it gave Ukraine roughly 0.74% of said amount. What's more, while financial and humanitarian aid is more or less given in real value dollars, the military aid was in good part composed of projected value. It included, for example, stored equipment, which otherwise might have never been used. Even if the US aid somehow remains at the same level, it's important to note that the US is not really giving Ukraine much of its arsenal important to it, at least not in a fight against China. Artillery shells, Bradleys and other vehicles, javelins, bullets and all sorts of ground combat equipment, even Gimler's missiles for the HIMARS. Sure, all those have been given fairly liberally to Ukraine straight from the US stocks. But none of those would really matter in a war against China. If it comes to the US having to use such short-range systems meant to attack ground targets, then that implies the US is already losing. One may say that javelins and other ground force systems might be important in a scenario where they are sent to Taiwan as aid. Sure, they might be, if they reach Taiwan. But as one of our older videos showed, why Taiwan is not gonna be another Ukraine, supplying Taiwan with aid would be hard, with most aid ships and flights not really being able to reach Taiwan untouched. So even the Gimler's missiles, with their 50-mile reach, were given to Ukraine. But curiously, the US was adamant about not giving Ukraine the ATACMS, all until recently, and even now the US said it gave small numbers of the shorter reach variant of ATACMS. What changed? the US finally started receiving the replacement missile for the ATACMS, the PRISM missile. But it will take years until PRISM production volume ramps up significantly. Why is the 300-kilometer reach ATACMS important to the US? Because by using the territories of the Philippines and Japan, and by launching ATACMS from HIMARS systems on ships, which has been practiced, the US can threaten Chinese forces. While the Philippine president said US bases would not be used in a war against China, that's very unlikely to be actually true once missiles start flying. China's sprawling base at Mischief Reef would be well inside reach of a missile launch from the Philippine island of Palawan. A good portion of southern Taiwan would be within reach of a launch from the island of Itbayat. Up north, Taipei and northern Taiwan could be covered by launches from the Japanese islands of Yonaguni and Taketomi. Let's now take air defenses as an example. The US gave 2 NASAMS batteries to Ukraine and paid for production of 8 more new batteries, which have yet to be completed. NASAMS batteries were orphan systems in the US, used in token numbers. On the other hand, just 1 Patriot SAM battery, much more important to the US, was handed over to Ukraine. Most anti-air missiles the US sent or is sending to Ukraine are Sea Sparrows and old-generation Sidewinders, something that would not likely be used against China anyway. So without going into further details, it's apparent the US is already quite careful that it does not divest itself of assets that could impact its capabilities against China. The US does give a lot when it comes to intelligence gathering, but that's a process that doesn't take away from US long-term capabilities. Satellites overfly the Earth all the time anyway, and intelligence gathering planes need sorties for practice as it is. The manpower used to interpret all that data is now used for the war in Ukraine, but if things start cooking with China, you can bet most of that staff would get retasked. Israel has ample intelligence gathering and combat assets. Realistically, Israel does not need direct military support from the US, so US military strikes on Hezbollah or Iran are not likely unless things really escalate, like Iran somehow deciding to start shooting missiles at Israel. That's not likely to happen. The US did send some military supplies to Israel. Most high-profile ones were guided bombs and missiles, as well as some artillery rounds, and lease of 2 Iron Dome SAM batteries to Israel. The latter could come in handy to US against China, as Iron Dome is specialized against short-range ballistic rockets. But A, those batteries may be returned to US after main Gaza ops finish, and B, the Iron Dome works best against slower rockets which are under 100 miles in range. Due to the seas separating US and China's forces and the larger distances involved, it's not likely such a class of rockets would be used much against the US. The US also sent tank and helicopter weapons to Israel. That's not something that's gonna be missing in a war against China. Israel also requested 57,155mm artillery shells. Again, a weapon that's not gonna be really used against China in meaningful quantities due to its range. Again, allegedly, the US also sent some 3,000 guided bomb kits and 1,000 advanced guided small-diameter bombs. 4,000 guided bombs and bomb kits straight from the US stocks is not a big number, even when JDAMs used in Ukraine are added, which are likely to be in the hundreds monthly, if that. According to the work we did in our How Many Smart Bombs Does US Have video, Pentagon has a stockpile of well over 500,000 such bombs. Annual procurement of such weapons for the Pentagon varies wildly, sometimes being at fewer than 10,000, while after periods of high use it can rise to over 30,000 per year. So in the grand scheme of things, JDAMs and other guided bombs were given to Israel and Ukraine in such small numbers that it's not gonna make a visible dent in US capabilities against China. For example, if some 6,000 guided bombs were given to Ukraine and Israel so far, that would represent 1% of the US stockpile, replenished by the US within several months. It's looking more and more likely the US does not intend to increase its help to Ukraine in the future. If anything, aid seems as if it might shrink in 2024. So it's the Middle East remaining as a factor. There, Israel seems to be dealing with Hamas in Gaza quickly, with Hezbollah up north being content with just occasional skirmishes near the border. Even if Israel starts bombing Hezbollah, it's unlikely it would need help from the US. The Israeli campaign might be, for example, just chasing down missile launchers from the air. All that leaves only Iran as the wildcard. Without the US intervening against Iran, the US today is quite free to pivot itself against China to a great degree. Wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East would not be a big factor to the US. However, if Iran does attack Israel and US retaliates, or if Iran does make a nuclear bomb and Israel attacks Iran and then the US again gets involved, it's quite plausible the US would have to redirect several hundred of its Air Force planes to the Middle East, on top of a carrier or two. An air campaign against Iran would not likely be a short-time thing, as Iran is a large country with quite a few air defenses. If there would be no Taiwan, it might last for months or even a year. Even if Taiwan flares up and the US is in the middle of attacking Iran, the US would still need some weeks to redirect most of its air forces there. Just leaving all of a sudden in the middle of a war would leave all other US forces in the Gulf and US allies hanging out to dry. Another potential issue would be Russia further escalating the war in and around Ukraine, but that's stretching it too far really. Russia is very hard-pressed to fight Ukraine as it is, and trying to widen the conflict might very well cause the EU's militaries to get involved. It's simply not realistic at this time. That's not to say that Iran escalating the fight against Israel is realistic. It's also quite unlikely. But it's something that, if it happens, might affect US power against China more than anything else mentioned so far. Even just 500 combat-ready planes used against Iran means another few hundred planes unavailable due to maintenance cycles, with over 1,000 more needed in Europe and to guard the US mainland when spares are included. That means the US would likely have fewer than 1,500 fighter jets available for China, again as some extra planes would be doing maintenance. So the US would get out of Iran's way very quickly if Taiwan flares up. But it's a few weeks that China might use to its advantage until the US refocuses most of its assets. So in that regard, right now, without Iran flaring up and without the US getting involved there, China deciding to go after Taiwan would not be pragmatic. China would likely be better off just waiting until the capability gap between the US and China shrinks even further. That's something that's been going on for years, and many of our videos covered it. We talked about China's stealth fighter production levels, about the US Air Force slowly losing its technological edge over China, and of a new generation of Chinese submarines closing the capability gap, and of naval tallies, both in number of large vessels and overall tonnage of ships, where it was evident China's navy is now growing faster than the US Navy in both metrics. More specifically, the Chinese Navy outputted a greater tonnage of combat and landing vessels since mid-2010s, with the trend still continuing in 2021 through 2023, with no real indication it will change. China also launched 3 carriers in a span of 12 years. The US launched 3 in 14 years. And when it comes to nuclear-fueled submarines, it appears China's new sprawling submarine construction facility has started churning out subs after years of prep work. The full production ramp-up is yet to be seen, so in the coming decades, it's not impossible China will be making more nuke subs than the US. Aircraft-wise, China is now outputting roughly 140 combat planes per year, compared to the US 110 or so, with the produced number of stealthy J-20 fighters being similar to the US number of F-35s, once the whole screw-up with Block 435s is ignored. The key metric is long-term trends, where China has been for years increasing their annual production at a faster pace than the US. The US nuclear arsenal is another example of US advantage slowly slipping over the years. China now has a satellite warning system up and running. The Pentagon estimates China will reach 1,000 warheads by 2030. So it doesn't look plausible that such production curves will change in the near future. Yes, the US is starting to scramble its industry and greatly increase its military budget, but how likely is it that China will not react to those increases and output even more? For 2024, the proposed Pentagon budget is some $840 billion, $900 billion when certain dual-use research is included, which can then be roughly compared to the estimate of China spending. If the trend of annual 7% increases for China continues, China should have an official military budget of 1.66 trillion yuan in 2024. The math to get to an actual comparable figure to US spending is somewhat complex, adding value of money modifiers, hidden expenses, and so on. Feel free to check out our 2022 video on the Chinese military budget to learn how it was done. But applying it to the 2024 value would yield 5.5 trillion yuan. If the currency exchange ratios between yuan and dollar remain similar to 2023, that would amount to $770 billion. That's a rough estimate, which may in fact be off by 100 billion either way, easily. What the Chinese military spending estimate can't take into account is commercial markups on various stuff. Still, it's evident China can use those 770 billion and make just as much stuff as the US can with its 900 billion. And crucially, the US has less room to increase its spending, as its 900 billion spending amounts to 3.2% of its projected 2024 GDP, while China's 770 billion amounts to 2.2% of its projected 2024 GDP. In a thought exercise where China would wait and play the long game, where economies of both sides would keep growing at the same pace and everything else remain the same, China could, by matching the US military expenditure in relation to its economy, eclipse the US military spending by some 29%. Of course, there is no way of knowing how the economies of either country will perform in the long term. If the winds of economy change, China may eventually start seeing the capability gap grow bigger again. But as big changes don't really arrive overnight, it does seem plausible that for the near future, next several years at least, China might conclude it's better off waiting to keep making more weapons than the US, waiting to keep shrinking that technology gap, and waiting to tip the balance of power around Taiwan more to its favor. In relation to that, all the US involvement and help to Ukraine and Israel is largely insignificant. It's only the wild card scenario of the US going to war with Iran or some other fairly big country that China might feel a very temporary window of opportunity has opened even earlier. But as such a war has not happened, and as it doesn't seem very likely it will happen, for now, China might feel its best course of action is to wait. The only other wrench that the US is throwing in China's potential plans is the Philippines. While the US is likely to use Filipino territory if it comes to a war, US forces would be more effective if there are more forces and more US military infrastructure in place there. Right now, the US is only revving up, starting to build up bases in the Philippines. Yes, we have a video on that too. Feel free to check it out. When built up, such logistical support on geographically advantageous territory close to Taiwan may be worth as much to the US as the entire military of Japan joining in the fight. But will that increased US efficiency, which will take a decade to ramp up on the Philippines, make up for a decade of Chinese economic and military growth? That's hard to answer. It could be that despite Japan arming itself more, despite Taiwan continuing to improve its military, and despite Australia allying itself with US more and more, China's economic and industrial growth, fueling the military growth, could be enough to compensate for all that and the Philippines factor, invalidating an invasion attempt right now. If the US, however, manages to fence in China economically, then that sort of favorable moment China may be looking for might indeed happen within the next several years. Even then, it might not be enough to produce a successful invasion, leaving Taiwan and the US victorious. As promised, a few more words on Conflict of Nations. I like to play it with friends. We start near each other so we can help each other if someone attacks us. So even if I'm unable to check up on the game, they can still assist. But given the slow and methodical pace of the game, I've usually no issues logging in throughout the day and giving out orders to my armies and provinces. Matches can take a week or two, but that's the way I like it. In Conflict of Nations, I can enter coalitions, build various weapons, manage my economy, trade with players, and generally try to outwit them before my armies swoop down on them. I love the modern World War III setting, nuke subs, drones, and missiles. With the Philippines, I'll probably have to go full naval, but it's a nice change of pace and strategy from other matches. You can try it out as well, and get that exclusive gift if you click the link in the description. You'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.